from a dead stop. They were well behind other nations, national interests around the world. And the flight of the Samoan Clipper is a great example of that pioneering spirit that that particular company was able to put forward in that really, really formative decade of the 1930s.
So yeah, I have to tell you, I've been reading the book and then taking credit for a lot of the stories that are in there. I've been able to repeat them back, to our viewers, and last night I got some very, very nice compliments on my storytelling ability. But I have to be honest and say that that a lot of those really memorable stories about Pan Am and the personalities involved came directly from our conversations and from your book. And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about what was the impetus? How did Pan Am get its start?
Yeah, it's after World War I now, and of course we were engaged in World War I, but aviation was in its very formative years, and the Air Force, so to speak, put forward was really more of improving of the technology than a real determining factor in World War I. But a couple of interesting things happened by the close. At the armistice, our production in the United States is sort of ramped up to its peak, which is typical, and then peace breaks out, and that's great. And then that sort of created a surplus in the United States of, Jennies and OX-5 engines that you could buy with no time on them in the crate for about $25 back then, which is not an insignificant amount of money in teens, but still really cheap. And meanwhile, European nations were going into civil aviation with both feet at the close of the war. Some of the rail systems and infrastructure had been decimated, of course, and this new technology of air transport was really catching on and had a lot of national interest with provisions. For instance, due to the Versailles Treaty, where countries like Germany were prohibited from militarizing, all of their energies were going into civil air transport, and they were probing around and establishing some pretty remarkable airlines to carry mail, communication. Really, the airplane first sort of transitioned from war machine, limited as it was in World War I, into peacetime as a communications tool. And airmail was extremely important. Express, or what we call cargo now, was next on the list, and passengers were third, if even on the list as an afterthought. Nobody was that anxious to get into an airplane back then, because safety was nowhere near what experience and enjoy today. So what really happened was, come 1920s, operators like SCADA down in Colombia were flying a fairly robust operation, and some of the military people in the United States were looking a little askance at that, as they thought it was a bit close to the Panama Canal, and oh, by the way, we should kind of get going on this aviation front. And we were really, third, fourth, fifth maybe in the world in aeronautics in the United States. So domestic airlines were fledgling as well, but they were starting to organize, and of course, airmail became the bread and butter of a flat-out subsidiary by the United States government to transfer the government mail service to the private sector. And all these startup airlines were starting up and failing, or merging and trying to carve out, their routes, which were all sort of targeted at airmail contracts primarily. But there was one group that started to form, a couple of groups actually that formed and were sort of pushed together through various reasons and expediencies. And Pan Am was really sort of formulated as a foreign look or international looking concern to start to really think about overseas flying, which was extremely challenging from a technological standpoint. And by 1927, a company by that name had formed, and it was really a couple of individuals who stand out. One, of course, was Hap Arnold, who was a military person and was ringing the alarm bell about protecting our hemisphere and safeguarding the Panama Canal in particular, and hey, we better get down there and see what's going on. So that kind of idea, coupled with the really amazing feel and vision of another individual named Juan Tripp, who had already at a very young age cut his teeth on several domestic, airline concerns, and was also extremely capable from the financial and organizational side, and well connected to other individuals who were really the first generation born to the air, so to speak, and that the airplane had been part of their early memories, really the first generation experience that with respect to heavier than air fixed wing aircraft. So Pan Am began in 1927 with, a business model predicated on trying to make a profit, but looking overseas, and as some of your commenters have covered before, they had a very small, very modest airmail contract from Key West, Florida to Havana, Cuba. That's really where they began, and their expansion was rapid and thorough throughout the Caribbean basin, and eventually, in 3, 5, 7 years, the entire Latin America with the exclusion of the Southern Cone. So that's really sort of the origin and the impetus behind what would become this highly recognizable brand or service mark of Pan Am.
And so then how did Ed Musick fit into all that?
Well, Musick was a crack pilot. He had been with Aero Marine, which was an earlier concern that had tried to fly the Florida Strait between Havana and Florida, the tip of Florida. And he was brought on board, hired as a competent, pilot with some exceptional experience. Overwater flying back then, even 95 miles across the Florida Strait, to fly on a reliable basis with a payload was extremely challenging and fraught with real peril. So Musick, who had a bit of a colorful past apparently, was already a professional aviator, so he was hired sort of on the spot and was in the right place at the right time. But he had something, extra, not just his experience. He had a approach as sort of seen as a real professionalism in a field where a lot of pilots were, coming out of sort of the daredevil or the rum runner kind of background and sort of their own man kind of attitude. But once, of course, you sign on with Pan Am and Musick became an exemplar of this, he was a professional aviator. So he quickly, he also had a mechanical background and was jack of all trades, as he had to be to keep these ships going under extreme conditions. He did a real tool bag, literally and mentally. So he was a natural, and he quickly became highly respected, highly in high demand to head these, and was a natural to become a chief pilot almost from the very first day of Pan Am's operations in South Florida.
So I've been saying for a while that that Ed Musick and Pan Am they really invented the air transport industry as we think of it, and what kind of things did they bring? What approach did Pan Am bring to it that hadn't been done before?
Yeah, that's a really great point. I always try to sort of emphasize the fact that those of us who remember Pan Am or were around to fly Pan Am before their business ended in 1991, just remember so vividly the sort of quality of their product and their service. But we would also tend to kind of think of, okay, there were the big four or the big six, Pan Am, TWA, United, Eastern, as far as U.S. carriers go, lots of some of the big names. The important thing to remember is Pan Am was not just another airline. They competed in an industry, with others that came up, and in a way they were sort of consumed by the offspring, sort of organic feature eventually. But they were in a league of their own because they did things first, and they tended to do them best, and they pretty much invented ocean air transport with respect to fixed wing, heavier than air aircraft. There were some interesting operations in the crossing the South Atlantic that were sort of modal, dual mode, intermodal with ships and surface vessels and aircraft that the French and Germans and even Italians were trying to put across. They were always sort of spotty. They were somewhat seasonal. They scheduled or not scheduled. There's always been this and that. But from the beginning, Pan Am set their sights on mastering overwater flying. Overwater flying, just brought an enormous amount of exponential challenges. Flying over land was no walk in the park, back in the early formative days, but got a lot of things going for you with respect to navigation. Fairly forgiving. You can take out landmarks, you get on the railroad lines. You could land if you got in trouble, if you found a suitable place, when you walk away. None of that applied in open water. So Pan Am started to come up with really inventive and fairly proprietary operating procedures. They hired a man named Andre Priester, who had come from Anthony Boker's, factory, and was an engineering background, but also was a natural sort of was behavioral scientist or organizational, genius who started to prioritize, what we're going to be, what was the culture going to be at Pan Am. Well, it was going to be about safety first, and it was going to be about sort of regimented, training and cross-training. So the innovations, came fast and furious at Pan Am. There were these multiple crew concepts. You talked a lot about the ships themselves, the flying boats. These were an extremely hybridized class of aircraft. After the inaugural, land-based and amphibians, smaller aircraft, the tri-motors or the Sikorsky started designing for Pan American S-38. These were a little more conventional. They were not conventional designs, but they were sort of conventional practices. Well, it was really once Lindbergh signed on as technical advisor, and Igor Sikorsky sort of decided that flying boats were the way to go, and as a lot of your crewmates there picked up on, it was most of the destinations are port side, as I said, and move out through the Caribbean. So they made this decision to go to flying boats, and yes, it obviated the need for capital expense to create runways. There were configurations where they wouldn't have even been able to build runways, but they pressed the manufacturers to make these remarkable aircraft for them. So even that, stands alone as really pushing for new technology. The crew configurations were really interesting because they adopted a redundancy training. So there was cross-training. It was a highly regimented situation. The captain and commander was also certified, and as the longer-range flying boats came in, they developed a credential unique to Pan American Master of Ocean Flying Boat, which was, a doctorate in aeronautics, basically, and something people compare to the astronauts as far as, really intensive levels of training and experiential requirements. So then the officer ranks, first the fifth officer, the flight radio engineer, the assistant flight radio engineer, the radio officers and the engineering crew, and right down to the stewards. So, the navigator could fly, a pilot could navigate, and this kind of cross-training redundancy was fundamental to their approach for safety. Then, once they decided, they were going to cross an ocean, and they always had figured, they'd do the Atlantic first, but as we know, there were political headwinds that forestalled the North Atlantic trade route, namely, and the British, who wanted reciprocity and sessions in North America, yet lacked the equipment to fly the distance, 1,900 miles from the Maritimes to the British Isles. They set their sights on the Pacific.
That was actually going to be my next question to you, John. Was the Pacific? So even with all, so please tell us all about
became even more so when you're trying to find a pinpoint island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. So radio direction finding technology was given top priority, and this young radio engineer named Hugo Literitz was able to modify the Adcock direction finder, which was really proprietary technology that Pan Am developed, to add another layer in addition to traditional forms, dead reckoning, which was electromagnetic compass, and sort of these crude drift readings they could get with their drift meters. Celestial, which they were doing as well, and doing well for people like Newton, who's a famous navigator, shooting the stars and selling charts, and then the radio direction finder top, the layer that gave them that margin safety to find these tiny little islands. But that's just a quick list of some of the innovations that contribute to marketing.
So yeah, that was going to be my follow-up to you, was that the Pacific is the most daunting challenge if you're doing transoceanic travel. That is really the moonshot, and what made Pan Am decide to do that, and what made them think that they could, and how did they tackle that enormous challenge?
Well, audacity, I think, but careful, assiduous planning. Trip's board was fraught with sort of divisions of angst, and what was good for the stockholders versus was this too adventurous and bold. I'm convinced Trip was anything but reckless and adventurous. I think he proved out the point that this company considered all the angles, moved very cautiously, yet Tripp knew instinctively and correctly that momentum was very, very important in his formative years. He had experienced this sort of diplomatic shutting of the window to the Atlantic, so he looked to the Pacific, always knowing they'd be attempting the Pacific, but not really thinking of doing it first. And he knew the importance of being first and the importance of momentum, and he started to look for, they look for diplomatic pathways that wouldn't present obstacles. He was in this company, operating from the Channon building on 42nd Avenue first, and before they moved to the Chrysler building, out of his offices in New York were global players. They were negotiating unilateral agreements with foreign states, by the dozens, and with or without State Department, say so. And so they were in a fourth dimensional chess game, on every front. So they saw the future, and they reached for it. And Tripp's ability to think through and think ahead 3 or 4 steps was truly uncanny. Originally, much like the maritime provinces were going to be the bridgehead to Europe, and spanning the Atlantic, they had fiddled with Alaska, of course, as the bridgehead to Asia, and trying to get up and over the Bering Sea Gap and Straits there, and down through Siberia. They investigated and tried all kinds of things. a bit of a sidebar, but there was a lot of energy put into, let's say, the development of the Atlantic, these mid-oceanic platforms. Lindbergh was heavily invested in that. DuPont put, I think, over $1 million in an engineer named Armstrong who came up with these very sophisticated floating airport ideas. They were going to station every 200 miles across the Atlantic, and they were going to fly loops between them. And they even got developed to the point where they were in multinational discussions about how to flag them. And that technology, that didn't happen, of course, but some of that technology would later go to oil platform design. In the Pacific, Tripp himself negotiated a plan with the Soviet Union, whom we didn't even recognize. And they were going to dig trenches across the Siberian wastes, and these flying boats, for some reason, filled those trenches with antifreeze and land these boats and try and fly down to Moscow that way. It was everybody's trying to penetrate and get the first leg across. Finally, they realized this wasn't going to happen. China didn't want us over their airspace. The State Department came knocking, asked Mr. Tripp if he finally tear up this memorandum that he was developing with Russia. And he finally bit the bullet and said, we've got to fly the mid-Pacific, and that meant breaking the Hawaii sector, 2,400 miles from San Francisco, which has the distinction of being about 160 miles closer to Honolulu, Los Angeles. Became the first step, and then where do we go from here? But they decided that we've got to do this, we've got to do it now. So he looked and searched, and he had some navigators and some geographers, and of course they're trying to find the stepping stones. And about Midway Island, Guam, which is a possession, as was Manila, was a regional territory type of suspension American War. So they still had a huge problem between Midway, Guam, which was an even bigger water gap than San Francisco to Honolulu, and that's when Lake Island appeared. And ostensibly, and I've looked into this quite a bit, and it seems to come out as the truth. Tripp himself spent a lot of time researching 19th century clipper ship logs in the public library. Would find these journals, these charts with these vague references, silent here. And finally, they confirmed that there was another tiny little atoll left that meant wait. A lot of these little islands hadn't really been anybody's radar, so to speak, for a long time, since the Guano Act of 1886, I think this one. We were mining nitrogen active tripartite treaty that you could lay claim to, but that had all played out. So with Wake as the linchpin, that was it. He could figure these distances out with these ranges. So that was sort of a chess game that they had to come up with, and they cobbled together this route. Now, there was also some precedent. There was a cable company that had strung a strand of like 7-strand copper wires, about 1.5 inches thick, covered in the rubber, all the way from San Francisco to the mainland of China. I think they bypassed Wake, but they went through Honolulu, Midway, Guam, Manila, onto mainland China. And that was a bit of a foundational line built on, but that other piece in Lake Island was key.
Terrific. So where in all of this, where does Samoan Clipper fit? What was their role in developing the Pacific?
Well, so this Trans-Pacific route, which of course would become the North Pacific by virtue of the addition of the South Pacific route. Once the Pacific route was established, and this is November 1935. Remember, this is 32 years after Kitty Hawk. To put a route across, the greatest ocean, 32 years after Kitty Hawk is a Hegelian achievement. And Hegel always talked about great historical moments or maxi. This is something that's in league with, the Brooklyn Bridge or the Panama Canal or the Transcontinental Railroad, which can't point to it. FMS is a line in the sky. So service started and commenced on a regular basis. It's all about doing it and being able to do it again. Doing it once was, a marvel. Doing it twice or, half a dozen times became a utility. That's what they were after. On a regularly scheduled service. It's hard to think about today because it didn't exist back then. Today, take it for granted. We can walk into SFO and buy a ticket in Hong Kong for 13 and a half hours. So the South Pacific was just an extension of that entire systematic installation of a global air system, and now it was time to get down to the antipodes and really link the bookends between North America and Australasia or Australia. Although Australia was not really negotiable, but New Zealand had a little more autonomy, said, hey, come on in. So the Samoa Clipper was formed, as you know. It was renamed on an S-42 modified to the B there for range, and that was the next piece of business, was to get down there, and this was even a little bit shakier. They had Kingman Reef, and they had, which was, as the name implies, a reef. So they were trying to pack this line together down there, and it was a Samoan that went down and probed these survey flights, which were highly exploratory and very essence of spirit of pioneering. Yet they were systematically applying their standards and their operating procedures and all this technology that they had marshaled. So they had one complete. They went back to try as mail service, very important, and suffered a catastrophic event, which stalled that line for several more years.
So,
hello?
oh, yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
I just got a odd sounding ping. So the Samoan Clipper is very much, of a piece of the entire effort to establish a global air transport system. And it stands out because of a catastrophe, which were fairly, not unexperienced, but there weren't a lot of them. So this stands out as a very poignant and fairly graphic illustration of the risk and the ultimate cost.
Yeah.
Fabulous individuals who are out there, in parts of the world that, applying new technology, pay the ultimate price for. So, very, very profound story. Very named Samoan Clipper really evokes that spirit and both the triumphs and the fortunate setbacks.
How would you say that event and that loss, how did that impact the Pan Am community, Pan Am family?
Yeah, it was devastating, of course. Some very poignant telegrams, cablegrams, and messaging around that. They're very profoundly worded. It was a huge blow. It was a body blow to the company. 6 months later, they suffered loss of the Hawaiian Clipper without a trace. And its cause remains unknown to this day. So these were setbacks. There's no doubt about it. But they were steps along the way in the system. I think there was a sense of mission, and as mournful and tragic as the loss was, they weren't going to let it defeat, the ultimate mission. In fact, they, I'm sure, felt they owed it, their fallen teammates to carry on. They would have wanted. So, very, very hard blow to the corporate body. The culture at Pan Am at this time was well established. There's an expression on the line down the routes that a lot of these really adventurous and incredibly skilled, ground crews, air crews, all these operators, their stations, and it was Clipper Glory. That was that's a kind of sort of intangible that can't really dictate or purchase. This Clipper Glory was a feeling. A lot of these people knew in real time they were doing was significant and deeply meaningful at all. That spirit prevailed. That carried them through, sure. So they kept on going. They warned, they were
Right. Now I'm going to. I'd like to ask you a question that has been posed to me a number of times, and it just boils down to that was 81 years ago. None of us knew those people. So what does it matter? Why do we care? Why is it important to remember this story and to search for Samoan Clipper?
Yeah. Well, I mentioned, you can walk up to the counter today and buy a ticket to be halfway around the world, before the day is out. That a huge part of the human population can avail themselves of. There's still many parts that can't, but for those who can, we sort of, assumed a sense of entitlement about that. It's incredibly easy. It's also incredibly new in, even human technology, let alone, epochal or, when you get into glacier terms. But that's brand new concept. I can be, in London, yesterday, and I can be in San Francisco at night. We should never lose sight of that. So the significance is, I've been thinking quite a bit through your expedition, enjoying watching as it unfolds, and I keep seeing these parallel themes. They were applying technologies that were unthinkable. I mentioned a moonshot. It was a moonshot to try and fly across an ocean back then, but they did it. I see a lot of really wonderful overlays between, Nautilus, Sea Air Heritage Foundation, what you're all doing out there. You're bringing technology out there. You're pushing, through to new knowledge, new capabilities. I think the spirit of the Samoan Clipper is just as alive now as it was then, and I think you all are sort of embodying that time today. We can't ever sort of fully appreciate unless we were there without historical reflection on what it took, what it was like. People talk about, and it's interesting, one trip made this point really eloquently. Everybody thought, they've compressed time and space. We can get between population centers that take, 2 to 3, 7 weeks, whatever, by surface vessel, by mule train, through the jungles, over the mountains. It could now be cut to a couple of hours or just a few days, Okay, does that make the world smaller? Well, it makes space and time or smaller or compressible, but it makes the world of opportunity that much larger. The trip was wonderful in sort of making that contrast. He was quite a champion of air travel, but he realized, as the poster said, no distant lands, and really, that's what I think we all strive for, whether much as about it or deep within our psyche, we want that expandability, and it's these new modes, methods that deliver that.
Amazing.
For ourselves to experience that. So I see it an absolutely unbroken connection between the Samoa Clipper flight and all survey flights and all the first flights establishing global air transport, and what deep ocean engineering is doing now, and well, are at the tip of that. So, bravo.
Well, thank you, John. That's fantastic. We really appreciate you sharing your vast knowledge and perspective, your special perspective on this subject. And I remember from our exchanges setting this up that you said you had availability till 4 your time. I know I've kept you 10 minutes past that, so I don't want to. I don't want to interfere with the rest of your day. I mean, I could certainly, and I think everyone at home could listen, for hours more and hear your favorite stories of Pan Am. But we really appreciate you taking the time and being with us here while we search for and remember a Samoan Clipper.
Wonderful, Russ. It's been a great opportunity and honor, really, to connect with you all. So we are certainly there in spirit, and we'll be, marveling at everything you're able to discover, rule out, and wish you all the best in the part of your voyage.
Terrific. Thank you so much. We're gonna continue on as long as we possibly can. So, thanks again.
All right. All the best.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
All right.
Who wants to follow that?
I was going to say, with that celebratory hands in the air, I'm actually going to move the RoboCam away from the back row, unless you guys want to give a wave. There we go. Bye, back row.
Oh, hello, front row.
Hello, front row.
Yes.
Give us a wave, and then I'll go back to side scan in channel 1.
So, Maddie, I know you had the chance to meet John just before he left SFO Museum.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It was a treat. I had connected with him through Doug Miller, and set up a time to go and sort of go through the archives at SFO Museum, and I had the pleasure of meeting John, and their archive team was just phenomenal, and they brought out these big binders, sort of like what you brought aboard the Nautilus, of historical photos and captain's logs and radiograms and some actual charts at the time, and then of course the original newspaper clippings from the San Francisco Examiner. So it was, that was sort of my geek out moment, was looking through all of these old newspaper clippings and seeing just sort of the tone that was used. John went into that as well. It was, this very somber sort of, it was a catastrophe really, and it was devastating to a lot of people who not only knew the team directly and knew the crew, but I think also sort of followed them and believed in them for advancing their mission of, exploring trans-Pacific aviation and transportation. It was really a treat to be there, and then to hear him speak about it again from the other side of the world.
Right.
Yeah, pretty wild.
Yeah, and it was kind of a double treat to have him follow just right on the heels of Jim Delgado and getting to share the expedition with him as well, and yeah, it's incredible the way they can each speak so eloquently and so fully on these subjects, just on the fly. So yeah, it was. I'm glad Samantha and the communications team were recording all that, and people can seek out those clips. I believe they post the whole progress of the expedition in kind of hour chunks, and you can scan through it and find those interviews and those discussions and listen to them again, and share them with others who didn't have the opportunity to listen in live with us.
Yes, that's correct. And actually, if you're watching on Nautilus Live, you can scroll, you can rewind backwards up to 12 hours. And then in the next couple days, we'll get those recordings up on our YouTube channel. So if you go to our YouTube channel now at EV Nautilus, you can see the last week of dives, or last week of 2 dives total. And then we'll be cutting a special clip just of the conversation with Ed Tripp and Dr. Ballard from earlier this week as well. That'll be linked out
Fantastic.
separately. So, but in the meantime, you can always rewind.
Yeah, we've had a lot of really great guests on this expedition. A lot of insight and knowledge and stories.
Well, yeah, and it really ties into, again, Dr. Ballard's vision for telepresence, for expanding the ability for people to participate, to project their spirit out here into the field and into the area where history happened, and be a part of trying to write more of it.
Absolutely, and we've talked a lot about Ed Musick, and John spoke about him as well. He was this pioneer in the aviation industry and sort of this unsung hero, but that he was at the forefront and also a little bit different. He was sort of this embodiment of safety and standard and duty, but there were 6 other crew members on board, and I think it's important that we remember that. And somebody just asked Russ, who were those other crew members and what did they do and what were their roles? And I think you are obviously best suited to answer that.
Right. Well, yeah, and we actually, we had a terrific live interaction yesterday with at an event that was put on by the Pan Am Museum Foundation at the Cradle of Aviation Museum in New York, and one of the attendees there as well, was asking, very pointed out that there's a tendency when we discuss this story that in the interest of being concise and getting our point across, we'll say the significance is that this great pioneering aviator Ed Musick and his crew were lost, and so 6 lives that tend to be reduced to just those 3 words, and they were so much more. So we know the first officer was a man by the name of Cecil Sellers, and was a captain in his own right, and had a long career. He had started in World War I, flying bombers, and then had made his way eventually to a Pan Am subsidiary in China called CNAC, the Chinese National Airways Corporation, and so he had, I believe he had at one time had even flown Chiang Kai-shek, and yeah, there was Paul Brunk, who was the junior officer and a promising rising star at Pan Am, and I think delighted to have joined now the elite of the Pacific Division. There's John Stickrod, who was the flight engineer, and had made a lot of these pioneering flights as well, and had flown on numerous occasions with Musick. And Jack Brooks, the assistant flight engineer, and Tom Findlay, the radio operator, and they're sadly united in the fact that in the aftermath of the crash, among the items that were retrieved was Tom Findlay's jacket and Jack Brooks's trousers with a bent tie clip in the pocket that allowed them to identify it. And then finally, there's Fred McLean, who was the navigating officer, and I know he was married with 2 young girls at home. And the San Francisco Examiner, from the day that the news of the tragedy broke, ran a picture that's headlined "Tragic Recess," and it's a photograph of Georgia McLean, who was 11 years old and came home from school and walked into the kitchen as her mother was listening to the radio to hear news. They were still waiting and hoping for word that the Simone Clipper was down somewhere safe and had just sat down to make repairs or wait for rescue, and so she walked in the door as the radio announcer was breaking the news that the entire crew had died, and that's how she found out her father wasn't coming home, and so yeah, so it was a very real tragedy for 7 families, and for the the extended Pan Am family as well. You can really sense it even just reading the radio traffic back and forth as they as the word of the of trouble spreads, and they worry and try and support each other and keep up hope, and then ultimately have to break the news, and the phrase that stands out in the bulletin that went out to all stations is it is with inexpressible regret that we announce that we confirm the loss of NC-34 with its entire crew. And that was for people who knew them, had worked with them, and were friends and colleagues with them. And there was a day later, company-wide, they organized a moment of silence, but where it was very private. It was kept only within the company. It was not public facing at all. In fact, there's specific instructions sent out to all of them not to make the passengers aware of what was happening. That it was just for them to remember their colleagues. And then they ultimately did do a public tribute on the steps and the rotunda of City Hall in San Francisco, which was really the company town for Pan Am and the Pacific Division, and there's quite a large turnout of people just packing the the area and paying their last respects to the crew.
Right. It's so easy to sort of get caught up in this expedition mentality and this search, and it is exciting, and it is making history and exploration. And it's also so important to remember those stories, and that these were real people who, impacts went far beyond their own individual families, and through across the world and across the aviation industry, really. Going back to the debris that was recovered after the accident, and you mentioned Finley's jacket and Jack Brooks' trousers with a bent tie clip in the pocket. How did we know that it was indeed Tom Finley's jacket?
I'm not actually sure how they made that determination. I know that it describes that the jacket and that it had the Pan Am wings still affixed. So I mean that was absolute and horrible confirmation that they were in the right place. That this was indeed the spot where or near the spot where Simone Clipper had gone down. And then the articles or the accounts just simply say that they determined it was Tom Finley's. I don't know if it was, maybe he had his a name tag sewn into the jacket, or maybe by the size, but yeah, I don't absolutely know. I mean, I think that with the trousers they knew the tie clip had belonged to Jack Brooks, and I think the fact that it was bent probably is indicative of the forces that destroyed the airplane.
And when the crew, they would be in uniform when they boarded the aircraft, and sort of for that that visual. But once they were aboard, they did switch into sort of more casual clothing.
Well, yes,
right?
and that's something that I actually learned from John Hill, that he described that the crew would board the airplane, and especially on a survey flight like this, where it's only going to be the crew on board, and so they're seen at the dock in their very snappy blue and white uniforms, and walk to the airplane in 2x2 and are seen to get on board, and then once they're inside and at work, most of them would shed their formal uniforms and change into coveralls, or if they were going to be flying at high altitudes, something warmer. I think there was even talk of one one navigating officer just changing into pajamas, when they were flying those vast stretches. Exactly. So, yeah, they got comfortable because this like that flight from San Francisco to Honolulu is 2,400 miles, and at the speeds they were traveling, a good flight would be 18 hours. Wow. So yeah, so they got comfortable. So no, and that does suggest that that when this tragedy happened and when they were overwhelmed, they were most likely not wearing those items of clothing when the plane went down. So I think that explains how they could be found still just floating free on the surface like that.
Right, and it's easy to sort of forget too. I mean, so you just said that it would take 18 or so hours to get from San Francisco to Honolulu, which
that's with a good tailwind. Yeah, that's a good run.
Best case scenario, right? And today that it takes less than a third of that. It's about 5 hours, and so when we're talking about aviation in the 1930s, it's definitely not what it was today, right? I mean, they didn't necessarily have pressurized cabins or air conditioning or heat or any of those sort of things that we maybe take for granted today.
Yeah, and I mean, we took two connecting flights to get to Samoa, and I think even given that, even with our we had a built-in layover, and even with we had some delays leaving the gate, and then 5-hour layover in Honolulu, and then continued on. And I think our total travel time, we still made it to Samoa in less time than it would have taken Samoan Clipper to reach Hawaii, and several days ahead of what it would have taken them to reach the same point on the map. So amazing progress that's been made, and it came really at the instigation of pioneers like the crew of Samoan Clipper.
And just to give a quick update to those of you joining in, I'm looking at the map, and it's pretty lit up from coast to coast all over the U.S. We also have plenty of viewers from the UK and Canada, Germany, Netherlands, Turkey, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Brazil. This is the first time I've seen you all during our watch, and we have Barbados. So welcome everyone. I believe we are currently on line 29, if I'm not mistaken.
That is correct.
Cool. And we finished up sort of that additional western area yesterday. We tracked back over line 11 to fill in a gap in coverage. We also set eyes with Argus Cam on targets 30 and 31. Those two did look to be the most promising, but they were in fact geological features. So we are still keeping calm and side scan surveying on. And that's written on the whiteboard downstairs. And I don't know that we have any other sort of promising targets at this point, but as John Hill, or I think it was Jim Delgado, mentioned, even sort of going through this vast seabed, we're still discovering where it's not, right? Where the Samoan Clipper is not located.
That's true, and in the process, we are seeing spots on this planet that no human eyes have laid on before. So we actually are learning and making discoveries really every second. Though, of course, we all have our hearts set on one in particular, but we will continue to side scan on for as long as our schedule allows, which should be shortly past midnight Samoa time this evening. So, and the thing is, I mean, I watch these images passing on the Argus Cam and marveling at these especially these very dramatic this volcanic landscape with the ridges and rocks and so forth strewn about that tend to tease us every once in a while, but we still get to behold these sights and realize that we are continuing to explore, and there's the always the tantalizing possibility that the wreck of Samoan Clipper will emerge from the gloom at really at any moment. So we are continuing on, in that vein, and will do so as long as we possibly can.
We're getting a lot of folks typing in, just saying, keep scanning.
We will. Thank you. We will.
Yeah, that's what we're doing. And so sort of going back to the day of the accident, based on the eyewitness account and naval records and the Bureau of Air Commerce report, we sort of have an idea, a timeline of what happened. And Russ, would you mind maybe just quickly running over what that timeline is, just for some people who may have missed it earlier on in the expedition?
So Samoan Clipper left Pongo Pongo Harbor on the morning of January 11th, 1938 at about 5:30 in the morning, loaded with 751 pounds of Air Express cargo for Auckland and 2,300 gallons of fuel in order to make a 1,800-mile flight down to New Zealand. About an hour and 19 minutes into the flight, they radioed back that there was an oil leak had developed in one of the engines, the number 4 engine on the which is the right outboard engine, and they were shutting it down and electing to return to Pongo Pongo rather than continue that long flight, down one engine, down to 3 from 4, so down to 3 from 4. So they had elected to return. The plane was sighted an hour or so later over Apia and Samoa, and it's supposed that that Music was there. He knew he had to burn off some of that excess fuel, and decided to take advantage of the opportunity of being airborne in that area and go overfly the harbor at Apia to see if perhaps that was could be used as an alternate landing site, and then continued on. They were seen to depart in the direction of Pongo Pongo, and radio in to their base at about 8:27. They radio in and say that they're getting ready to land, but have decided to dump fuel because the landing area at Pongo Pongo is extremely restricted. The harbor is surrounded on 3 sides by mountains, which creates a great spot of sheltered, calm water. But it's a very tricky approach to come in really from the west and then over this 800-foot ridge and then dive for the water as quickly as possible, because it's a very narrow and relatively short landing stretch in that straight, calm section. So it would normally be done at the end of a long flight where the plane was very light, and in this case they were not, and Music wouldn't have wanted to risk the crew trying to make that tricky maneuver, even for a pilot of his great ability and experience. It was always hair raising, always white knuckled to do that. So he even knowing that this was also something of a risk to dump the fuel while in flight, they had decided to do so, and then the radio operator shut down to reduce the risk that a stray spark from the set, the radio set, would ignite the fuel vapors and fuel in that process. And so at last transmission, ceased at 8:35, and they did not come back on the air. So after a loss of communication, word spread that there was trouble. And they, Pan Am radio at Pongo Pongo, continued trying to call the aircraft, thinking that, maybe if there had been some sort of problem and they had set down in the water and maybe the mountains were blocking that transmission. But the Navy had a ship assigned to Pongo Pongo, a seaplane tender called USS Avocet, with a scout plane, a float plane assigned to it, a Grumman J2F Duck, the ship's captain, Lieutenant Williamson, who was also the pilot, took it up and was following. They had gotten some leads now. After an hour or so, they'd gotten reports had come in from the northern coast of the island that people there were seeing smoke to the northwest. So I'm sure with a real knot in his stomach, Lieutenant Williamson